Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about writing a planless app. This discussion is going to be a little bit more interactive. I want you to talk about your ideas, and I can help you refine them. We can sort of discuss sort of pros and cons of different kinds of strategy, but in general, I'll obviously have sort of some commentary at the beginning, but I don't want this just to be me speaking at you about critical apps. I want this to be more of a student engagement kind of thing, so it's more helpful to you. In terms of my background in terms of critical apps, I think the last 10 years of my debate coaching career, I've largely been the person writing, coaching, and strategizing planless apps. When I started in 2012, I worked for a set of smaller schools in Virginia. So I started coaching at Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, and then Broad Run High School in Ashburn, both of which, I would say had somewhere between 2 and 4, policy debaters in one time, and, strategize sort of chaos that way. And then for the last 5 years, I've been the director at North Broward and, have been sort of the primary argument coach for a number of teams that have read planless apps. I guess most recently, Mancini and Rubini, Deo and Farinay, and Deo and Sebastian Rubini. So this is probably my general area of expertise. Kind of want to divide this up into 3 areas. Why write one? What are some methods for writing some planless apps? And then a little checklist of things that your planless app needs to answer. Okay. And then after that, I'd like to sort of speak with you about your ideas and help you sort of decide whether or not they're strategic or not. So why write one is the sort of first thing that I want to talk about. There's a number of reasons, and I don't think everybody has sort of the same motivations coming to writing a critical affirmative. I think, it's probably a combination of, or at least one of these things. The first is that it means something to you. So, there are a set of critical affirmatives and planless affirmatives that are focused on your identity, or perhaps a community that you're a part of that you really sort of feel passionate about, and that sort of drives you to read a set of affirmatives. The second is that perhaps you're not necessarily personally connected, but you are interested in it. So this would be the set of folks who are like, I really like to learn about, for example, post-structuralism. I really like to learn about settler colonialism. And I sort of, began, my interest in critical affirmatives because I really like to read is generally sort of the thing that happens there. The third is more strategically oriented. I think there's sort of 2 thoughts about this. Generally, people suck at answering critical affirmatives. Like, it's just really bad. Like, they spend most of their time preparing only for affirmatives with plans, so then they fall apart. And it's pretty embarrassing when they debate them. And then the other sort of subpoint of that is that it can corner people's strategies. So, on this, topic, I would say that there's probably only a few things that you can say against planless affirmatives that are consistent across the board. My guess is that people read, topicality arguments and the CAPK like they usually have. They might have, maybe a spicy postmodern take on like psychoanalysis or something like that. The only other, big 2 additions that I would have for this topic would be perhaps essentially the industry dissent versus planless affirmatives. So I think if the affirmative decided to say something like resources are bad, they could just come back and say resources are good. We need to economize them, have water markets, whatever it is their defense of resourcification is, they might use that. They might even go sort of harder. And so there's like 2 versions of this. I think you could go harder and be like the industries themselves are good, or you could be like the idea of resourcification is something that is beneficial for the environment. So you don't have to go all in on industry always good, but maybe resources are good. And then the other sort of variant of critique that you might hear this year is probably a resurgence of some anthro style arguments. Arguments that are like the focus on water, shouldn't be so much emphasizing the social, but maybe the intrinsic value of water against some of the, more identity and community driven affirmatives that exist. we can talk about that a little bit later, and I can talk about how to answer those as well. I think there's the next section that I kind of want to talk about is just what are some methods by which you write planless affirmatives. So, I think the biggest mistake that people make is they just kind of start by being like, here's my idea from last year, and hopefully I can plug and play, and this will work out great. Instead, sort of my suggestion is one of these three things. The first is you could start with a familiar theory, and then you should think about sort of its relationship to the curricula surrounding the topic. So you could start with a familiar theory and think about its relationship to the curricula surrounding the topic. So, let's say that, you're an expert in Afro-pessimism, or you're an expert in settler colonialism, just because you've debated it so much and read so much of the literature surrounding it. It's like, yeah, like you might start with sort of, searches about settler colonialism and whatnot, but then you have to sort of apply that to, how we want to sort of talk about the water topic, right? So, I imagine that there's probably going to be a number of settler colonialism affirmatives that, criticize sort of the starting point of the federal government protecting and resourcification, and then assert that, we should have sort of different alternative epistemologies to sort of imagine sort of a different kind of relationship to water. Okay, so that's sort of one approach. That approach is okay. In my opinion, it's not the best approach because it usually, I sort of discussed the plug and play thing. A lot of times when people just sort of use their previous theory, it's like, well, it's pretty easy for the other team to just find the answers to previous theory section, right? So it's like, if I think, for example, that North Broward is going to read a settler colonialism affirmative again, it's like, it's pretty easy to go find my work from like 4 years ago and read it in that debate, and then just have a framework argument, and not much will be different, right? There's the sort of edge in terms of cornering the strategy, et cetera, is kind of non-existent. The second sort of method of planless affirmative construction, I think, is team or genre specific. It's team or genre specific. Essentially, the way that you would do this is you would start with a set of 2AC answers to framework, or 2AC answers to TUSFG, and then consider how to connect sort of the protection of water resources to that 2AC. So I'll give you a couple of examples that are not related to water, and then maybe one that's related to water. So when we were preparing for the TOC in 2019, we knew that there was a Highland Park team that had a set of topicality arguments that were very much focused on skills and infiltration and sabotage. So instead of sort of starting with the 1AC, like, we're good at, anti-blackness arguments, let me, create something that has some relationship to anti-blackness, we sort of went backwards. We created a 2AC to USFG skills. So we were like, what might be some of the best responses that I've heard on sort of the sabotage bad argument? And we were like, okay, we have some pretty good cards that says, sabotage is ineffective, maybe trains students to sabotage themselves. Maybe the institutions themselves are not very good. Maybe, lawyering is not very good. And once we sort of started with that premise, then we constructed an affirmative around that. So we were like, what F might fit that model? And so we were like, okay, the affirmative that ends up fitting that model ended up being the race war F, is sort of what we ended up breaking in that quarters of the TOC. There is a debate that's up there, and we basically sort of reverse engineered a 1AC that made sense in relationship to the 2AC we're giving. Another example from that particular tournament, so the finals against Montgomery Bell, one of the same things that we knew was that, the 2N, Aiden, was very good at describing a set of fairness and clash impact and why clash turned the case. So, we started with that premise, and we're like, what are some great critiques of, fairness, and what might be some way that we can avoid some of this clash stuff? We ended up, thinking that some of the language-oriented offense was better, and we ended up with an affirmative that, criticized sort of white linguistic practices that were homogenizing. That was the federated blackness app. So the way that sort of those apps were created was not immediately being like, I like, Afro-pessimism, can we create an affirmative surrounding it? I was like, here are the 2ACs, the common arguments, how can I create a 1AC that sort of fits these themes? I think for this year, One, such thought might be, if people are reading a set of, topicality arguments about building skills in the context of water, some of the, better critiques that I've seen have been in the context of managerialism, right? So you might have sort of a 1AC that, builds from that premise, right? So if the 2AC is largely going to be a critique of managerialism, a critique of, technocracy in water, you can have a 1AC, right, that sort of largely, deals with sort of criticism of technocratic debates on both sides, both critiquing the idea of resourcification, but also critiquing just that, maybe top-down approaches that are focused on, rationalism and science and stuff like that should be criticized. So it's like, you've started with sort of, I'm going to answer the skills argument, and then I've created an affirmative. Okay. The reason why sort of this is a pretty good strategy is that it keeps teams kind of on their toes, / it does innovate around the thing that they do, right? So you're not just writing a 1AC in the abstract, you're creating a 1AC based off the strategy that you already know the other team is reading, and then reverse engineering a 1AC that makes sense. The third way that you could do planless aff construction is just sort of a deep dive into the topic. So I think there's a number of affirmatives that are probably unique to this particular topic. I imagine that there's a couple of areas of study. For example, it's been a little while since anybody has read anything about like object-oriented ontology or arguments about, I think I mentioned earlier, anthropocentrism. You could technically take some of those arguments on the affirmative, right? And you can sort of create sort of topic-centered approaches about sort of water and our relationship to it. Maybe some good sources here. There's like a book titled Thinking with Water, I believe, by Astrida Nemanis. I believe it's spelled like this. There might be a set of, affirmative things that are in there about sort of our relationship with water and sort of, criticizing technocracy that's specific to sort of this topic, right? So you could sort of do a deep dive on Google, Scholar and sort of look for things that are a little bit unique. The nice things about some of those unique affirmatives is that people don't have readily available case negs. So, my guess is that most of y'all on this call do not have like case neg -000 sitting around somewhere. Neither do I right now, right? So, those are probably, some good places to sort of generate arguments, because my guess is what's going to happen to you in the 1NC is going to be just a topicality argument, and maybe the CapK or the industry decide, depending on which direction people sort of want to go with that stuff. What not to do? What not to do? I think there's sort of two things that, you should sort of keep in mind in terms of that. The first is, it cannot just be a state bad critique, and it cannot just be a critique of resources. Okay, it can't just be a state bad critique, and it can't just be a K of resources. The reason why is because those two arguments are just negative arguments. It would be pretty easy for a neg team to come up and read T and be like, well, read on the neg solves 100% of thing 1 and thing 2. Like, what does this really do for you, right? I think instead, your evidence needs to say not that the state is all, not just that the state is bad or that the idea of resources is bad, but that debates or switch side curricula over protecting water resources bad. So the difference between those two things is that you need to have a card that sort of criticizes the back and forth debates over, for example, protecting resources, not just the idea of a resource, right? So it can't just be like a card that says, you try to manage the environment, that makes me sad. Or, let's say settler colonialism, just a card that says the federal government's not very good, they shouldn't have jurisdiction. You need to have a card that's like, debates that settlers have over whether or not we should protect water resources, that back and forth is largely meaningless, or perhaps is genocidal or whatever. Or if it's the your version of managerialism, you need to find a card that's like, the debates over whether or not we should protect the resource, both sides of it is bad. It's like both the side that's like we should try to conserve and restore and stuff is bad, and the side that's like we should extract and do mean stuff is bad. Does that kind of make sense? So it's like that needs to be sort of a cornerstone. The reason why sort of you want that to be there is because it makes it harder for the other team to just be like, read on the neg, right? Because the whole point is that you shouldn't read the other version, like topical version on the aff, right? Like you have a built-in criticism of that concept. The second is, you should not read the same thing versus every team. You should not read the same thing against every team. I think one thing that a lot of K affirmative teams tend to sort of miss is, different affirmatives are better against different things, right? So, for example, if I was, thinking about a Baudrillard aff, it's like that Baudrillard aff probably has some pretty good criticisms of skills. Does it have a very good criticism of fairness? In my opinion, not really. Does it have a very good criticism of things like Afro-pessimism? Like, no, absolutely not, and almost in fold territory, right? Or if I was putting together, like, let's say, I was putting together an affirmative about like Afro-pessimism. It's like, the Afro-pessimist critiques of whether or not, we should exist in civil institutions, disrupt them, fairness considerations, those cards are pretty good. The cards against skills are pretty good. Is it great against like teams that like to go for like humanism good or the capitalism can are very effective at it? Maybe not, right? So I think the thing you want to think about is just every critical aff has like a strength and a weakness. So you should evaluate what aff you're reading based on sort of the flexibility of teams, right? And usually every team, regardless of whether a policy or a K team, will be inflexible in some way, right? So even sort of teams that are more critical will have some generic that they rely on, maybe the Academy K, right? Or maybe psychoanalysis, or this team really likes to read Baudrillard, but it's some generic that they'll always fall back on. So sort of my suggestion would be to have 2 to 3 critical affirmatives in store that you can sort of cycle through against specific kinds of teams. And that's also something that, I think has been pretty effective for the teams that I've coached, is I've always been like, you should, begin the year with like 3 affs, one that, has a very good angle against fairness, one that has a very good angle against like a skills version of topicality or state good, and one that has like a very good angle against critiques. Or else, you're going to be sort of stuck in a situation where it's like, like this aff was good against T, but like horrendous against the Cap K, right? Or another sort of example this year at the TOC, I had coached a pretty good team reading a set of KAFs, and that team, our goal was to have sort of a different affirmative for different kinds of teams. So, we knew, for example, that a team that we debated in Octas, the Lexington team, liked to read a topicality argument about skills. So we built an affirmative about, Black trans that we thought had a very good angle against some of these skills arguments that exist, versus like we knew, for example, Minneapolis South liked to really go for the cap K. So we had sort of a different strategy for the affirmative that had some, good angles against capitalism. We lost that debate, but I do think that the strategy itself was good, right? So it's like, that's kind of the mindset that we sort of want to go into when, putting together an aff. Is usually for chaos, it's like, the nice thing is you don't have to cut all the 2 ACs to disads and counterplans and stuff. So you should have the time theoretically to put together like 2 or 3 of these before sort of the season begins. The last sort of thing that I kind of want to talk about is just a checklist of stuff that your KF needs blocks to. And then I sort of want to open the floor for sort of a larger discussion about ideas that you might have, or K questions that you might have that you'd like, disambiguated. So checklist. There should be a couple of things that generally sort of exist for your critical affirmative to be effective. I do think that, some kind of small case overview that spans from the 2AC to the 2AR is generally effective. That's usually not a suggestion that I give for any other speech or genre of argument. But for critical affirmatives, there's usually sort of a big theme that you can use against all off-case positions. And there's also the pretty good likelihood that the negative really doesn't answer your case overview and you automatically win. So here's sort of an example. There was a team from North Star that was quite good 2 to 3 years ago that had sort of this small overview that described sort of the issue with respectability politics and telling Black women sort of what sort of politics that they must take. The nice thing about that particular overview was that it had sort of an angle against a bunch of different kinds of off-case positions. So if they won that respectability politics argument, that's clearly a disadvantage to the cap K that says that if you're not Marxist enough, you shouldn't really show up. Framework arguments that are like, these are the skills that are important, and if you don't do them, that's not very good. Or even the high theory stuff that, try to sort of indicate that there's a particular kind of, Black woman that maybe is objectionable, right? So it's like that larger sort of theme is something that applies to all kinds of off-case arguments, and thus is beneficial to have as an overview. In this overview, so I think the mistake that a lot of teams make is that they'll just sort of re-describe the aff for a minute or a minute and a half. And that's a huge waste of time, right? Because it's just like, that's not doing you any good. The thing that goes in that overview should be sort of a thematic impact turn or thematic critique of different kinds of off-case arguments that can be consistently applied everywhere. So that's sort of, thing one that you want. Thing two, you obviously need a set of two ACs to topicality. Okay. When you're thinking about two ACs to topicality, I think the biggest mistake people make is that they'll just have like two AC TU SFG, and then they'll just read two AC TU SFG in every debate. Yeah, that's not going to win you any debates. Instead, I think you want to think about your T blocks modularly. So the way they, I usually like to set them up is you should usually have sort of a top level framework to AC that has a couple of things. It should have sort of a piece of evidence, or at least maybe a redescription of what debate is. So, if you've been in any TUSFG debate, you've likely heard something like, debate is a game with two sides, and everybody's here to compete, and competition comes first. So fairness is an intrinsic good. Blah blah blah. It's like that part. It's like you need some contestation of that general claim. So it's like I would start with a card or some analytic that describes that debate is something else. Perhaps you could describe that debate as not a competition, and perhaps some of the larger community concerns come first. You could assert that debate is a competition, but there are some other values that matter more. So maybe pedagogy matters more than fairness, who knows? But you want some frame about what you're going to describe debate to be. Then, another thing that should go in that top shelf is some kind of counter interpretation of some variety. So, whether that be, you interpreting words or describing sort of just how you've described your relationship to the topic, or what affirmatives and negative teams should do. So that's the next thing that should occur. The last thing that I would include in the sort of top shelf area is probably some kind of critique of the definitions that are being proposed. So not necessarily like the cards that are like fairness is bad, or your skills lead to Karl Rove, or whatever it is that people like to read, but usually like a critique of the set of definitions they've proposed that say something like, either sort of strict textualism to determine predictability is bad, maybe the expert vernaculars that those definitions are in a bad, something like that. Okay, so that's block one for topicality. The other block should be sort of focused on specific things that you're going to say against specific arguments. So after the thing that says like 2AC answers to TUSFG top shelf, the next set of things I might have would be like 2AC AT fairness. So that's where sort of all of my stuff against fairness arguments go, or 2AC AT clash. That might be where I do all my, work for iterative clash, whatever else, or 2AC AT truth testing, right? So the difference between sort of 2AC TUSFG and then big rant and, having modular blocks allows you to, before the 2AC, put together something that makes sense and actually applies to the thing that's being described. Okay. Some other sort of thoughts about T, I guess two. One is you want to use the other team's vocabulary. If you don't, you'll immediately lose the debate. So, for example, I think one big source of frustration, I think, for teams reading chaos is that a lot of times they feel like the negative will just splatter a bunch of like policy PRL style memes and then like get away with it. So like the neg will just say a bunch of like half-baked thoughts like neg on presumption because of false positives, which side debate solves the case, TVA solves, and yeah, it's like you didn't really say anything there, but it's like the judges have now gotten 4 arguments that could independently lose you the debate, right? So one of the reasons why that kind of happens is because the AF team is not sort of following and tracking the language that's being used by the other team. So if they use the phrase refinement, you should make sure that you use the phrase refinement when responding to the argument in the block. You should not just have a generic skills block that you read every single time. You should have some, flexibility to change the words so that the words are very specific to the things that are said. I think another sort of pro about that is if you're able to sort of use the other team's vocabulary, your criticisms become a lot easier to make. So let's use the example of argument refinement, right? It's pretty easy to make the set of arguments that's like, so you really think that critique debates are not refined? So for example, all kinds of revolutionary Black debates have happened in the last 20 years. Is your claim really that, those things are not refined and sophisticated, that there's no value that comes out of those things, right? So using the language of the other team is sort of, very effective in sort of making the claim that you're saying. And then, secondly, you want to sort of discern what kind of topicality argument is being forwarded. So I think there's sort of two main varieties. One says that fairness is sort of the most important consideration, and that there's not really any other impact. Topicality is just a procedural question about whether or not rules were followed. So this set of T arguments is slightly different from, there is a benefit to debating about the topic. It builds skills or has some external impact that helps us with reality outside of debate, right? I think those are two radically different approaches to topicality, and it requires sort of different ways to navigate. If it's the former, my guess is that you'll probably be making arguments that are like, debate is not like an isolated competition. We need to think about sort of, how we develop as subjects potentially. If you're, against the skills version, you'll be likely making a set of arguments that are just like, well, the skills things that, you're talking about don't result in very good skills, right? So there's a different set of, strategies that sort of go, alongside both of those things. One last thing about framework before we move on to some other checklist items. Some teams will do this thing where they merge all of that together. So they'll just be like, topicality is a voting issue, 1, fairness, 2, skills, 3, state stuff, 4, dogmatism, 5. So that's not that strategic, and you should very much sort of, exploit that. If they make all those arguments at the same time, right, it sort of dulls the effectiveness of each of those arguments. So, for example, let's say that, the 2NC really likes to make this argument that's like, fairness is an intrinsic good, debate is just a competition. Well, if you're also making a set of skills arguments, that actually seems to deny that premise, right? Fairness is actually not an intrinsic good. Fairness is actually an internal link that results to a set of skills. If you impact turn those skills, then it also would indicate that fairness would be a bad thing, right? So you want to sort of, if they read all of them together, you want to sort of concede one of the premises of the things that's happening there. So I might say something like, you cannot go for fairness as an intrinsic good because you have conceded that it develops skills that spills up into the real world, which is a thing that we're going to concede. We just think that the skills you spill up to are really bad. Right. And that might be sort of a very effective push that you have against teams that have like the, 6 standards about topicality. Okay. A couple other checklist items. You should have sort of a defense of your affirmative against the CAPK. I think there's generally sort of 2 main focuses of the CAPK that kind of exist. The first is a CAPK that's sort of focused on how you've historicized things and the sort of focus on labor being important. So, it'll be less about sort of what is the blueprint, but just what is the way you have come to analyze the world. So they might be like, if your 1AC is more post-structuralist, they might be like, your focus on language is not very good, and we need to focus on materials, labor, the process of production, right? And that's sort of the more important thing. The other variant of the CAPK tends to be more like the state good K. So they'll be like, they'll say something like, the plan is state phobic. They, refuse to use organization, and sort of state phobia is bad. It means that we can't pass policies to stop things like climate change, and the alternative is to basically have left governmentality or maybe a communist vanguard party that has sort of top-down governance, right? You need sort of different angles for those different kinds of CAPKs. So, for state phobia, you need some cards that are like state phobia is good, or like, using the state, it's not particularly helpful. It should be pretty easy for, certain affirmatives. So like if it's the settler colonialism affirmative, like I feel like it's pretty easy to be like, well, it wouldn't be very helpful to have left governmentality with like Biden, who probably is not going to help natives very well. Or, even the communist vanguard party, it's like, I don't know, who let them be the, jurisdiction and, create commons over the land. It's like, are they like a bunch of settlers that are doing the vanguard party. It's like, there's a bunch of things that you can criticize about that. The labor focused stuff needs a different angle. So you can't just be like state good, or sorry, state bad against labor focused, right? Because they can be like, well, we also think the state's bad. We just think that your discursive focus is bad, right? So you need to have sort of a defense of sort of your method in relationship to historical materialism is the phrase that I would sort of look up cards for. And then a set of cards that maybe talks about sort of your aff in relationship to state phobia. And having sort of both of those things will keep you sort of afloat in some of those CAC debates. Last set of checklist items. These are a little bit more fringe because this is sort of depends on what kinds of teams you're debating. You'll likely need to have like a set of headers for post-structuralist critiques. I think the easiest set that people will be reading will be like academy / commodification / cruel optimism style arguments. So essentially the argument that, we should not be presenting the 1AC visibly into the academy. It's a recognition politics that maybe commodifies the radical potential of these things. There's a number of different critiques that sort of fall into this hat. But it's like you need some defense of, what is your relationship to the academy in terms of the 1AC? What is it that you're going to say about commodification? My guess is that most affirmatives will say something like commodification is inevitable, but there is still a benefit to the aff, even if it is commodified, or maybe victim blaming, the native scholars or black scholars for being commodified is a bad thing, right? So you might have like a set of affirmative angles against that. You'll likely have sort of a hat for some other post-structuralist critiques. So some people like psychoanalysis or Baudrillard. It's like you should think about sort of what your relationship between your scholarship and that is. And then finally, two other headers. I would be wary for the impact turn strategy. I think in previous years it mostly just ended up being like hedge good. I think this year it'll be a little bit more nuanced. I think teams will say something like resources are good. And either read their aff or have like a reason why the industry is good and then ask you to defend it. You need to think about sort of for that block, one of two things. You got to think about either, are you just going to no link it and be like, this is not really what we're debating? Like the whole premise is not that we really give a shit about industry. It's just debate about debate. So, the resource stuff that we were talking about is not like, something that spills over. It's just how we debate in this debate. Or, are you going to take it head on? So if your affirmative is like a capitalism bad aff, it's like you might as well take it head on and just be like, communism is great. Your industry dissent sucks. It's not very sustainable. The cards are, pretty good on the resource bad side of things. So you might just take them up on that debate. And then finally, I would sort of suggest that you have some angle for why, your affirmative has some traction with arguments about anthropocentrism. I think these arguments will actually be more common this year because of, the nature of the water topic and the cards being written. I think one, interesting K, this is kind of a random aside, not really related to K-AFs, but more negative. I think there will be an interesting K that I don't think camps have produced this year that was somewhat prevalent on the oceans topic, which is a criticism of using water as a metaphor for social movements and politics. So there's a set of people who are sort of anthro-K people that are critiquing the left for using non-human, objects and processes as, basically stand-ins for their politics. They'll, use sort of water as a metaphor to suggest something about a human-centered politics rather than establishing water as a means in itself or as having some value in itself. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'm gonna stop my rabbit from eating my house. Ruby, hey. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so there'll be a set of arguments that are just like water metaphors are bad. There are definitely cards out there that are like ocean metaphors are bad. And I think those cards actually will be pretty helpful this year because I think a number of affirmatives, for example, about like the Black Atlantic or that are talking about the Zong or whatever might have some different conceptions of water that might be metaphorical and not necessarily literal. And I think that set of Ks might be pretty interesting to read. At the very least, it might not be the A strategy, but I think it'll be new enough that it'll sort of force the affirmative to, take some prep and, work on their stuff. So those might be sort of some general suggestions that I have. One last thing before I sort of open it up to questions. I think there are different kinds of strategies against critical affirmatives from different teams, but in addition to that, there's a different level of, like, there's different kinds of 1 and Cs structurally as well, right? So I'd say there's like 2 variants of teams that kind of exist here. One is the team that's like, we really are so inflexible that we're just going to read like one off. So they'll just be, or 2, right? They might be like T cap and case. That's what we do against all K teams. Or I can't even debate the cap case. It's just going to be T and case, maybe for some teams, right? So, that will require you to have sort of a 2AC that's like a long version of T and a long version of the cap K. There's also now, I think, a more prolific, set of teams that'll just be like the 1 and C is going to be like 8 off. We don't really have, an idea of what's going on. So we're going to read as many things as possible. And hopefully you bumble, an approach. I think, the team that probably popularized this is a little bit is North Broward MR and now Michigan PR, right? Every time they debate a K team, they're like, here's 12 random things that we're going to say to you. And the goal of that is to, basically, put some pressure on a K team that tends to be a little bit less technically proficient. So they'll end up getting to like topicality with like 3 minutes, and then it's just a disaster for the affirmative team, because then the neg will just spend all their time in the 2 and C on that. Or, a more flexible version of this might be able to take something else. I know, the top number team this year also did this too. So like, but they tend to be more critical. So like Akash would be like 6 off, and then the 2 and C would be like big on Afropessimism or something, right? So it's like, there's a version that's just like lots of little stuff in the 1 and C, and then like big on one thing. And that requires you not only to have sort of the long, 2 ACT block, but forces you to have the short one too. So you need like long and short versions of T and cap, and then probably the other things also. So like the Academy K, some teams like to read a 1 off. Other teams like to be like, here's 2 Academy K cards alongside a C of crap, right? It's like that, those two ACs need to be different, or else you're going to run out of time. You know what I mean? So that's sort of a final sort of consideration that I would like you to sort of think about. Okay, so that's sort of what I had. I'd like to, leave the rest of this fairly interactive, take some questions. If you'd like to field an idea to me and be like, do you think this idea is good? I'm happy to tell you that it is or it's not, or, give you some suggestions. Or if you have general questions about KFs you've debated in the past or things you have, feel free. Yeah, Aaron.
So I guess like one of the ideas that I was thinking about for a KF was kind of like, I know like DDI, but like a water like personhood app, but like from like a more critical perspective of like reimagining a relationship to water, and like kind of like combining like settler colonialism with that. Like an idea to like natives like view like water as like more than just like a resource, and like debates about that is bad. What do you think do you think like that's a good idea? And like if so, like what do you think like the main issues do you think like are with it?
So I think the pro is that the card quality would be pretty high. Like, the cards that I've looked at that are just like, critiques of water as a resource from indigenous perspectives are like very good. I think there's 3 drawbacks. One is, okay, hold on, sorry. Hey, what, come on. Okay, all right, you're on timeout. So one sort of drawback, I think, is that people will have a tendency to, I think people will gravitate towards that app. Like, I think in the past, like even the CJR topic, when I kind of thought the cards were like only okay, like the number of teams reading settler colonialism apps was like super high. So it's not about to shock anybody that the 1AC is going to be about settler colonialism. So that's one thing. I think the second is, it depends on sort of the set of things that you want to say on topicality. So there are some okay cards that come from like the settler colonialism perspective that critiques things like procedure and maybe gaming. You need to make sure that you have good cards on sort of the switch side, competition element of things, because otherwise they're just going to win on read it on the neg, right? Because it's like, what's likely to happen in your T debates is this is going to be, they'll read their normal T stuff, and then the TVA will be, they'll be like the GDDI native ZAF or the DDI water, mining, the mining AF from the KM lab. And then they'll be like, read it on the neg, you were a resource K. AF says resource good, neg says resource bad. So it's like you need an angle against each one of those things, or else that's a big fold. And then the third is, settler colonialism, at least in my opinion, has sort of a rough relationship with the CAPK when the link is about resources. So usually I feel okay about going into some of those AF debates with settler colonialism and CAP, because you can be like, well, the land relations, et cetera, is sort of the thing that, physically undergirds sort of all of our production processes. And, that's a good thing. I worry in this topic that if your critique is, the big issue with sort of, settler indigenous relations now is the question of resource. It's like, well, why is resource bad? Because it economizes water. So then it's like, it seems like capitalism is maybe the root cause of the thing that is causing the issue with the resources. And then just any risk of a link, plus the alternative is likely to solve, right? So it's like, that worries me a little bit about that style of affirmative if I was to coach that. That being said, it's like, as long as you have a pretty good angle for the permutation and some alt takeouts that say, the commons that don't consider things like settlement are bad, that might help you a little bit. But yeah, I would be a little bit concerned about sort of the CAPK and making sure that, because the root cause debate seems handily neg, right? That's the thing that concerns me a little bit about that.
I had another question actually off of that. So I guess like when I was like thinking about like reading KFs, like I was thinking about like reading them against like K like centric teams, because like they'll like get them off like they're like generic like policy blocks. So I was wondering like, do you think like there's an app that like does like a better job at that than of like stopping K teams from like reading like their K blocks?
So I honestly don't think that that's a great strategy, mostly because K teams are more ready to debate the K. The irony of all this, I think, is just like if you ask like my top K debaters whether they would rather debate a KF or a policy F, they would instantly say KF. And the reason why is because they've read more of some of the critical literature, so they know kind of what's going on. They know what people's sort of like tricks are, so they know they're pretty much ahead. And then the other thing is just usually K teams tend to fall apart after like they basically don't have a link to a certain style of advantage. So like, sure, the K teams might have blocks to like hegemony apps or global warming apps or the economy apps, but it's like, if you ask a K team, you're like, hey, like, do you have any link cards about modeling for the India-Pakistan Indus Water Treaty? It's like, no, like they are not gonna have, I mean, maybe they do, who knows, but it's like, it's very unlikely that they're gonna be like, our specific policy scenario, we have a thing that says it's wrong, right? They're gonna have to be like, okay, the only thing I have left is like extinction is bad, extinction rhetoric is bad, the fiat K, and then like hopes and prayers, right? So I do actually think that the policy F strategy is usually a little bit more effective in figuring out sort of predictable, responses from the other team. That being said, if you were going to read a KF against certain K teams, I would not do so until you figured out what their inflexible generic is. So let's say, I was debating some team and it seems like every time they debate a K team, they either say Afro-pessimism or the Cap K. So we kind of noticed that of like Capel last year. So we were like, okay, so like we can read a KF that, has some good premises against those two things. But my guess is that if they had read anything else, we would have been hosed. Like we would have had nothing. So that's kind of the danger of that is, you want to sort of write, like, I think you just want to make sure that they're so predictable that you're like, okay, I can just write the KF, their response to those two or three things. You don't want to just jump in and be like, you're a K team, so here's KF, because that usually is a way to get burned.
I see, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, a pretty good example of that. We tried that at Bronx Science. We had debated the CK McClatchy team for the first time, BG, I think, and we didn't know that they were a K team, so we kind of assumed but didn't know, and so we read a random KF and then just got annihilated, just clobbered, because we had no clue. Because we were like, yeah, their negative strategy is probably going to be the Cap K, and then they were like black feminism, and we're like, yeah, I'm screwed, nothing. This app has no angle, so I think that's kind of a dangerous move to make. So, Jack and then Jackson.
Okay, so I'm researching this after reading that book by Street and Amanis, but her other book about bodies of water and kind of like the embodiment angle of the topic. And then So let me kind of explain the intersection. My partner and I, we usually read like queer theory arguments. So I found this kind of interesting article that talks about queer sociality in communities, like, and how it specifically implicates water. So do you have any recommendations for how to go about debating the more community-based impact turn to topicality?
Yeah, definitely think the Nimana stuff is good for that, by the way. I definitely cut a couple of those cards and I thought they were pretty high quality. In terms of the community-based impact turns, I think the thing that you kind of want to do is you want to make sort of those community-based impact turns intrinsic to T as much as possible. So I think the bad version of this is it'll just be kind of a list of bad things the debate community has generally done, which the debate community has done some terrible shit. Like, don't get me wrong, but it's like, the neg will just come back and be like, well, but like that's not because we were like you need to be topical. That's because there's probably some terrible people with some horrible social norms that are not related to topicality, right? So you kind of want to avoid that frame of reference. So there needs to be, I think, two things that happen. One is I think the community-oriented, set of arguments should maybe be about the set of definitions and debates that we do have. So what is kind of the consequence of debating as if water is a resource is probably a way to sort of drive your community-based impact. Perhaps it establishes sort of this idea that, debaters should posit themselves as masters of nature or whatever it is that you're going to say about that, right? It's like there needs to be some angle that's sort of tied into the idea of the definitions that are being described. And then the other set of things is just you want to make some arguments about sort of the procedural form of the set of args being made. So it's like if you're making, a critique of, maybe the set of sort of rigid rules for communication, right? It's like that's a good set of things that you can sort of critique and then establish back into the community. So it's like maybe sort of, those procedural focuses prime us to not care when sort of those procedures end up excluding people. Then we have like a pretty good sort of heteronormativity K about sort of that procedural element. So I think the way you want to sort of think about it is just like, what is the K of the thing? And then how can I connect it to the debate community? Not what are the bad things that have been happening in the debate community and then trying to jam it into topicality. I don't know if that helps or answers your question, but.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense. So more like, in that Namana's book, like she talks about the like mastery over nature. So like, I guess you're saying connect that to kind of like how that implicates maybe the bad things that also happen in the community, how there are parallels for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Cool. Great, awesome, thank you.
Of course. And then Jackson.
Yeah, I was wondering, I wasn't sure how good of an idea this was, but I had talked with my coach last year about this topic, and we thought about like a cap necropolitics K on the neg. And so I was wondering, like, do you think that type of strategy would work on the AF, like water being kind of like weapon of cap and necropolitics? Or...
Oh, sorry, you said cap and necropolitics, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think the cap K angle, the thing that I sort of think about that is, I think the cap bad version of this affirmative, I feel like it's not great as a planless AF. And the reason why is because a lot of the, folks who are sort of writing about this are talking about sort of making water into a commons or a public good. So I almost think like the cap bad AF probably is better off reading a plan and then critiquing the DAs that come about, right? So it's like they'll say politics or the industry decide. It's like, well, I mean, the communism good AF has some pretty good angles against both of those things, right? Or I guess they could say cap good, but it's like I would wager that the cap bad cards are probably higher in quality than the cap good for water cards. Just gonna put it out there. So I almost think that set of arguments probably is better off with maybe a plan, or I think a good example is Glenbrook South last year had some okay arguments about just how should we reimagine the seat of government? Should we conceive of a vanguard party that controls government and maybe it's water resources, and that might be sort of a creative way to sort of put together an AF. For the necropolitics angle, I know there's a couple of authors who like talk about necropolitics in the context of water. I think like Ahuja is one of them. I think Neil Ahuja. I don't quite remember the first name, but there's a couple of articles that are out there. I think there is something to be said about it. My guess is that critique is going to be focused on top-down governance and resourcification being bad, and likely would be a little bit more high theory in its approach. But yeah, I think those are fine options. You just need to make sure, though, that the necropolitics K in particular does not fall into the trap of just being state bad or just resource bad in general. They would need to make sure to say that the back and forth debates over, for example, conservation and restoration versus economizing water as a resource would be a bad thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think like a good method idea would be for something like that?
It's a little complicated because it kind of depends on what you're reading. I don't know off the top of my head just like what is the method for the necropolitics argument. I would maybe look at that Ahuja, stuff that sort of talks about necropolitics. I would maybe, take a look and see if Jaspier Poir has stuff about the environment. So like obviously she writes about necropolitics, but it would be rough to be like we suicide bomb nature. Like that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So
Yeah.
I would see what some of those authors have to say about the environment, and then that should produce a couple of methods that should be a good starting point.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Ananya and then Devin.
For this topic, I guess, what do you think are the KFs that are more receptive to policy judges, so you don't like fall into the trap of you then don't like have two AC blocks to answer most of the policy arguments if you do go for a more policy AF?
Sorry, rephrase that a little bit. So you're saying like how to write a KF that's more policy receptive, or are you saying?
Yeah, so in front of a policy judge, so that like I guess it doesn't happen as often, but like one of the judges that just like really does not go for KFs, but then you don't just like run a policy AF and then have to defend against like Adolf that you don't have blocks to.
That's a tough question because it's like, it's probably unlikely that those judges will be like super excited about critical affirmatives. That being said, I would say so it's like the North Broward prep sheet definitely has a couple of people who like policy stuff. And we found that the folks who are, kind of on the fence about receptiveness to KFs tend to like it if, so it's like they usually have two main things that they have issues with. One is that you didn't counter define anything. So it's like, you read an AF and then the neg is like TUSFG, and then define a bunch of words. And then you were like, LOL, I have no definitions. And it's like, they basically perceive that as very similar to how a policy AF would operate. So imagine if you were reading like atmospheric water and then the neg was like T water resources doesn't include atmosphere, and you didn't read any cards. You were just like debate about the topic is the counter interp. It's like they basically find that to be like equally ridiculous. So it's like, one main thing is just like having some set of counter interpretations that establishes some limit to the topic is pretty important. So I think the two sets of apps that I thought might be a little bit more effective against policy teams would be, I know GBS had that app about like just reimagining sort of a communist government that's doing the plan. I think there's a couple of ones that were like abolition related that I think people were a little bit more receptive to, because it's like the abolition app definitely linked to DAs, and there was a pretty okay response that was just like, well, the federal government, whatever. It's like we can redefine a bunch of these things and then be okay. I think another one is like we read like a federated blackness / homo criminalis whatever app that seemed to indicate that there was a black federal government because they could do policies. So it's like those are all examples of just like you've sort of transitioned a little bit so that you've counter-defined sort of the set of arguments that you make. The other sort of thing is like a lot of these judges are really mad about just you don't engage anything, you just say no link to all of the things. So if your AF is going to be like resourcification debates over resourcification bad, it's like you want to make sure that you're debating the industry dissent and stuff like that, so that it's like very clear that's like, well, we're not saying we're not going to debate any of these things. There are obviously some pretty good strategies. It's just that we should expand sort of a horizon for what some of those things are. That being said, I do think that there's a set of judges that are just so anti that it's just like a non-starter. And I think for us, we either try to strike them. If it doesn't work, then we usually try to have a set of affirmatives that we have like one that we have a couple of affirmatives that are for different areas, so like T fairness, T skills, and for CAP, and then we usually did try to maintain an affirmative that had a plan. Perhaps a more critical affirmative, right? So think of CBA and sort of the Turner group. Like they can read 9 off, but all of those things are all related to cost benefit analysis. So it should be relatively easy actually to just critique the set of things that are coming up. So that's sort of my general suggestion. I know that's kind of helpful and kind of not, but hopefully that clarified things. Devin.
How should a tutor approach the sats? Like if you give them the link, how should you critique the sat?
If you give them so a couple things. If you give them the link, then the way that you should sort of approach it is you're probably just impact turning the thing they're saying, right? So my guess is that you've spotted them the link because they, have read a disad that says resources are good. Hopefully that means that we have a bunch of resources bad cards, and for an impact turn debate, you need a couple things. You need an external impact, so something that the DA is not able to turn. You need to have something that turns their impact, right? So, if their impact was resourcification is key to the economy, if you have a set of cards that's like resourcification is unsustainable and thus the economy will collapse, that would be nice. And then lastly, you need some impact defense, right? Like you need some defense to their thing. So it's like, why does economic decline not cause war if they're going to be the econ impact? So that's kind of the approach, is like you need to think about it like you're going into an impact turn debate rather than something that's like we bracket the case. Because the whole premise of allowing the dissat is that you're not bracketing the DA, right? So it's like you can't really be like, okay, comes first and your DA doesn't matter, because it's like, well, they're going to be like, well, DA causes extinction. So like what? Right. So it's like you need to make sure that sort of your approach needs to be impact turn with impact D, I think, if you're going to spot them the link. That being said, I think there's, benefits and harms to that, right? So spotting them the link means easier time on topicality, although lesser time. You probably need to read a lot more cards. Versus if you don't spot them the link, you don't need to read any cards at all, but now you've basically proven that your affirmative doesn't really allow for negative engagement. So it's like there's only there's different costs, strategic costs sort of related to either of those options.
What about in the context of chaos with a plan?
Chaos with a plan, sort of the main thing that you kind of want to do is just, so you're obviously, so chaos with a plan, you shouldn't just spot them the link, right? In fact, the link should be heavily contested. So for example, the CBA app that the Turner lab is, writing, it's like that app needs, some no link work on a politics, right? It's like if it's like a courts app, it's like, well, like, you should be pushing back and being like, the risk is negligible, and then having negligible existential risks outweigh environmental ones is bad, right? So it's like, it's not just kind of like K-framing that's just like util bad, so like you don't get a DA. It's usually like DA very small in addition to, K-framing that's like, that should be offense for us. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? Okay.
Wait,
yeah.
sorry, I had one.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's your thought on KFs that have a plan text, but they like don't defend it until like they say like the plan text is like a metaphor for something else?
Well, it seems like they never defended it at that point, right? So it's like if they just have the resolution and they're just like it's a metaphor for something, it's like, I mean, yeah, sure. That being said, like I don't suggest the version where it's like there is no plan and then it's like you defend it later, or you had a plan, you don't defend it anymore. That usually tends to lose to largely judges being annoyed. So like usually it makes more sense to just pick one or the other. Like you can just be like the SAF is about the debate community, or you could just be like the SAF, is actually about communism and we're going to defend it to the death. I think both of those they're great. I think that I have one foot in the not defending pool, and 1 foot in the defending pool usually leads to just getting massacred past the 3-3 bracket.
Okay, thank
you. Yep. Any other, Devin, do you still have a question, or is that from earlier? Okay, cool. Any other? Sounds good. Well, enjoy lunch. I believe we have a lab at 1 or maybe an elective at 1, but either way, have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.